Hi, I'm Tom Patton. I'm the instructor for Art History 484, The History of Photography. I can be reached at patton@csuchico.edu. I'll generally be checking my emails Monday through Thursday during the academic year. I run a blog for this class as I do all my classes. This is the very first blog that I started, so the address is not great, but the address for my blog is ARTH 484 History of Photography myblog.wordpress.com. Let me state that again. I'm going to show you a sample of the blog at the end of this introduction. The address again, ARTH 484 History of Photography myblog.wordpress.com. I will post grades on Blackboard, but all the vital information for the class will be on the blog site. The calendar's there, the syllabus is there. On the calendar, you're going to find links to all of the lectures required for the class, as well as a listing of the chapters of the textbook that follow along with that. The syllabus is going to cover much of the information that I'm covering in this introduction today, but what the requirements are, how you're going to be graded, and that kind of thing. So all of that's on the textbook. All of that's on your blog site. Let me go in and talk a little bit about grades since I mentioned that. The things that are important to me in this class is that you listen to the lectures, that you read the textbook, and that you do your own personal research in photography. And I'm going to direct you a little bit in all of these areas. The requirements for the class follow along with those three things. They follow along with reading the textbooks. You're going to have 3 quizzes based on the textbook, and indeed you can answer the quiz questions for the most part by directly quoting from the textbook. So you'll need a copy of the text, and I don't care if you get an electronic copy or your own copy in hand. Either way will work, and I'll talk about the text more in just a little bit. So the quizzes address questions directly from the text. There are 3 quizzes. They're worth 25 points apiece. The class is based on 200 maximum points. So 75 of those are from the 3 quizzes. In addition to that, you're going to be asked to do a visual presentation. You're just going to present it to me. It's not terribly dissimilar from the kinds of lectures that I'm going to do for you through the course of this class. And I'll show you an example of that at the end of the discussion today when I show you my blog site. The visual presentation will be worth 25 points. So the 3 quizzes and the visual presentation is 100 possible points of the 200. In addition to the quizzes, you're going to have a midterm and a final. You're going to have those posted on the calendar on your blog. You'll have 2 weeks to complete them. The type of question will vary a little bit, but for the most part, they're short essay-style questions. Usually you can answer most of them in 2 paragraphs or something similar to that. There will be some sort of variation in questions, though. But anyway, the midterm and final are worth 50 points each. So you have midterm and final, 50 points each, the 3 quizzes at 25 points, and the visual presentation at 25 points. You get a perfect score on all of those. There's 200 points. I grade on a percentage, so if you fall within 90 to 100%, you're going to be in the A range. If you're 80 to 89%, B range, and so on down the line. My general sense is if you do the work in this class, you're going to do fine grade-wise. And when I say the work, you listen to all the lectures, you read the textbook, and you read it thoroughly, and you do your own research. Those are the 3 areas that I'm most concerned about. The due dates for the quiz will be listed on your calendar. You can turn work in early, but I'm not going to grade it until after it's due. And it generally takes me a week or 2 to grade everybody's work and post the grades on Blackboard. As I mentioned before, the midterm and final will actually be posted on the calendar, but they're not posted there now. The quizzes are. The midterm and final will be posted 2 weeks before they're due. I'll send out a notice to you that's coming up as well. And indeed, you'll have 2 weeks to complete them and get those back to me. I will also list the due date for the visual presentation towards the end of the semester. It'll be listed on the calendar as well. Going through my notes here. The textbook. I hope this isn't confusing, but there's 3 editions of the textbook. Any one of the editions is fine. And again, I don't care if you get your own print copy or if you get an electronic version, if either edition 1, 2, or 3. I know this will probably come in backwards, but Seizing the Light, A History of Photography is edition 1 by Robert Hirsch. Seizing the Light, edition 2, A Social History of Photography, also by Robert Hirsch, is the 2nd edition. And the most recent edition, different publisher, Seizing the Light, A Social and Aesthetic History of Photography, again by Robert Hirsch. If you're not onto this already, what publishers often do is they make slight variations to one of their books so that a teacher will require the students to buy the newest edition. Therefore, the publisher doesn't make any money on used copies, but if they are always requiring new copies, then the publisher makes more money. So, frankly, it's a great book. I don't care which edition you have. You'll be able to answer the quiz questions on any one of these editions. So whatever you can find, and whether you want it new or used, or you get an electronic copy of it or a print copy of it, I'm going to leave that up to you. At the Ira Latour Visual Resource Collection in the art department at Chico State, we have a copy of the textbook. And when we're back to meeting for regular classes, you'll have access to that. Well, talking about the history of photography. Photography encompasses art and science and technology. It encompasses journalism, commerce, meaning the business side of photography. It also encompasses folk art, and I would argue that snapshots are a form of folk art. We will study, to some extent, all of these arenas of photography. We'll look at the art and the artist and the theories and the techniques that shaped our view of photography. Those techniques in the early days of photography come fast and furious. That slows down a little bit in the middle decades of the history of photography and speeds up again towards more recent times. Photography was introduced to the world on August 19th, 1839. So photography now is about 181 years old. Although history is not finite. What do I mean by that? I mean, history's history. What do I mean that it's not finite? It's really that our knowledge of history is changing, and it does change over time, and it amplifies and sometimes changes our knowledge of the past as we learn more and more about it. So, in a sense, history is always changing. It's not finite, and our knowledge of it changes. Some of the information that I used to say, I now say other things as we've learned more about the history of photography in my period of teaching. One example, I studied with Beaumont Newhall, who during his day was the foremost photographic historian. He had been the curator of photography at the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York. George Eastman House is a museum and gallery that is in the old house of George Eastman, who was the head of Kodak. Anyway, he was the curator there. He was also the curator at Museum of Modern Art, New York. I studied with Beaumont at the University of New Mexico. Anyway, on the cover of Beaumont's book about William Henry Jackson, Jackson was one of the pioneer American landscape photographers. There's a nice, beautiful landscape on the cover of that book. Years later, Beaumont found out some additional information that William Henry Jackson and another photographer, Charles Savage, had met up. They both talked and discovered they were going to go to some of the same places to photograph. And rather than both of them going to both places and working independently, they decided, well, you go to one place and I'll go to the other place, and we'll just make extra negatives and we'll trade negatives at the end. As it turns out, the cover of the William Henry Jackson monograph by Beaumont Newhall was a Charles Savage photograph. He was a little embarrassed by that, but also knows that it's a part of photographic, or it's a part of history, or as our knowledge of history changes, our view of it changes as well. My approach to the history of photography is going to be more or less chronological. When I say more or less, there's going to be times where I start out maybe in the 19th century and build the idea all the way up to the 20th century. But indeed, I will largely do a chronological approach. Some professors do a reverse chronology, starting at contemporary times and working backwards. I'm going to start at the prehistory of photography, too, when photography was introduced, and build up towards more modern times. Another approach is to do a thematic approach, and frankly, my approach to photography is a little bit of a mixture of a regular chronology from the past to the present, mixed with thematic approach to photography. One of the things that I saw advertising at history of photography classes at one of my alma maters, San Francisco Art Institute, a number of years ago, the photographer teaching the class advertised it as a biased and generalized overview of the history of photography. Whether any teacher or textbook writer admits that, all histories of photography are biased and general overviews of the history of photography. Each one of us thinks something is slightly different or more important than another, and will make our points. To my way of thinking, and it's why the textbook as well as the lectures are as important to this class, is you're going to get two different takes on some of the same information, and the overlap of the two is probably going to give you a clearer idea of the actual history of photography than any one history of photography. And I will give you a lot of information in this class, and that's one of the things I want to warn you about the lectures. Get the gist of the lecture. So when you get in the lecture, what I'm generally going to do is I'm going to start off with a premise or a theory or an idea, and I'm going to present that to you. And then I'm going to show you samples that either back that up or challenge it. Sometimes I'll refer directly back to that premise. Sometimes I'm going to allow you to make those connections. Sometimes I'll end with a conclusion, and sometimes I won't. So that's something you should be aware of. But don't get too involved in the minutia in the lectures. Get the general points that I'm trying to make. When I say that, my suggestion is that you take brief notes as I introduce a new theory or a new photographer, maybe a line or two about them. And therefore, when you may need to go back to those notes for your midterm or your final, you'll have a place for those resources. But again, if you get the gist of the talk rather than all the minutia, for example, when we first start off, the processes kept changing and refining and getting better, and but they went through a lot of trial and error with different kinds of processes. I'm going to talk about those different processes. It's important to understand, for example, it's important, for example, to know what an ambrotype is. And while I'm going to show you in brief how they're made, that's not something I'm going to ask you about. I may ask you to define an ambrotype, which you'll be able to do in a few weeks after you've seen the lecture. But indeed, I'm not going to ask you about chemicals and things like that. So do know that there's a lot of information, and at first it's going to be difficult to decipher what's important and what's not important. But look at the big picture, go for the big ideas, look at the 2 or 3 photographers that I'm presenting, usually at the beginning of the lecture, but presenting as the key people in a particular movement or illustrating a particular theory, as it may be. A couple other words about the lectures. The history of photography is heavily based on Western cultures. Travel and trade routes to Asia, Africa, and South America were not well established with Europe until after photography's invention in 1839. Many of the trade routes weren't built until 1850 to 1900. So in the very early days of photography, it was really centered more in Europe and America than it was in some of these other continents. So know that it may seem like I neglect certain areas. What I'm trying to do is just give you a general overview of the movers, leaders, and shakers and theories that developed photography as we know it. Let me say one other word, I guess, about me as an instructor. I'm a working photographer. I'm not a photo historian. I have a pretty good knowledge of photographic history, and hopefully you'll see that as we go throughout the lectures. I have 3 degrees in photography, an undergraduate degree, and then 2 graduate degrees. Both of the graduate degrees have a minor in the history of photography. I studied with Beaumont Newhall, who is one of the key photo historians, indeed maybe the most important photo historian to date. So I studied with him directly. I studied with Marjorie Mann. I studied with Fred Parker and others in the history of photography. And so I'm confident about my knowledge of the history of photography. But as a working photographer rather than a photo historian, I may take a slightly different bent. I think it's one of the advantages of taking a class like this is sometimes I'll be able to give you some practical experience about working as a photographer as relating to some of the photographers that we're looking at. But I think it does provide a sort of a practical or basic, I should say, difference between how I might present the history of photography and how a person trained directly as a photo historian would do so. Do know that part of my MFA degree required a 200-page piece of original historical research. So I had to do the same PhD requirement that the PhD photo history students did. But indeed, my track and focus has been as a working photographer rather than a historian. And I think that will, in some ways, color, both good and bad, how I present the history of photography. Again, coming up in just a minute, I'm going to show you the blog. But hope you enjoy the semester. I hope you get something out of the class. And again, I'm always available for questions Monday through Thursday at tpatton@csuchico.edu. Well, if you type in ARTH 484 History of Photography, myblog.wordpress.com, it will take you to this front page of my History of Photography blog site. Notice at the top I have my email address, tpatton@csuchico.edu. In addition, you'll find here the calendar and the syllabus. All 3 quizzes are there already. I will be posting the midterm and the final exam. There's also information about your visual presentation, which I'll go over shortly. There's some other information on here. This is really just for your edification. And then contact information again for me. And I usually check my emails during the academic semester, Monday through Thursday. Let me click over to the calendar and show you the calendar here. At the top just explains the calendar a little bit. But the calendar here lists all of the different lectures. So after the first lecture, the origins of photography, notice that I have a couple of chapters. These are chapters in your textbook that relate specifically to the stuff that we talk about in this lecture. Below that, notice that I have another link. This is just for your edification. I'm not going to ask you about information that show up in these links, but they're links that I found that were related to the topics that we were talking about, and I wanted to include them in case you wanted more information. But generally speaking, for the entire semester, all of the lectures are listed here, so you can see them on the calendar. And I don't have the dates in here yet, but I will list the due dates for the quizzes as well as the midterm and the final and the visual presentation. They'll all be listed on the calendar. So it's important to check the calendar and follow along with that. Let me go to the syllabus for just a minute. The syllabus largely covers the stuff that we're talking about today, description of the course, the textbooks, that kind of stuff, how the grades work, which I've already explained. So let me just scroll past that. And it will show you information about the final exam, the midterm, the visual presentation, as well as some academic university information. So all of that's available to you on the syllabus. Let's go back to that main page. And let me show you briefly the visual presentation. Essentially, with the visual presentation, what I'm asking you to do is select, and I have a list of photographers here that's pretty lengthy. These are photographers that I have, in one way or another, neglected or overlooked in the history of photography, yet they've all offered something to the history of photography, and so I wanted to give you the opportunity for additional research on one of these photographers. So your visual presentation, you should select one of those photographers and create a PowerPoint or some similar software program, which you then convert to a PDF once you're finished. Create a title page that has the photographer's name, where they were born, and their inclusive dates when they died, or if they're still alive, let us know that. If you can find a portrait of them, include that. Follow that with a chronology, providing a list in sequence of the photographer's most important achievements. Follow that with a summary in your own words, an explanation of the photographer's work. Why are you looking at their work? What makes it significant? Then I want you to follow that with a sequence of 15 to 20 examples of the photographer's work. Include titles and dates when they're available to you. Following that, a bibliography that includes at least 3 examples of both print and online sources for that photographer's work, and I've given you a sample here. In addition, at the very last slide, put your name and your campus email address so I have a way to get a hold of you. Convert it to a PDF and you email it to me. There's my address. Let me show you a sample. So this is a visual presentation that I put together. It's so-so as I look back on it. I'd probably give myself a B- on this effort. It's certainly not an A work. But here's my title page. I'm talking about Art Sensibaugh, and particularly I'm looking at his landscape photographs. And I found a picture that included a copy of the camera that he used for these photographs, and so I included that as part of my title page. Here's where you can do better. The chronology, I could have developed more, probably should be its own page, and speak more specifically about the highlights of the career of Art Sensibaugh. Also, I should have developed the summary a little better. This should be its own page and talk a little bit more about the meaning behind his work and why I felt it was important. The bibliography I did okay on, but you should have at least 3 examples of print publications and 3 examples of online publications of the photographers that you're looking at. Follow that by 15 to 20 images by the photographer. Include titles when you can. I'm just kind of scroll through these Midwestern landscapes that he did and notice that he's using this panoramic format. So it really emphasizes the flatness and in some ways the barrenness of some of these landscapes. But I'm going to scroll through those to get to the end. Just to remind you, the very last slide should be your name and email address. Coming up, there we go. That's your visual presentation. And that's the basics of your blog site.